Known as the Beverly Hills of the South, this beautiful, quiet, upscale neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, is home to the privileged and the wealthy. Socialite Lita Sullivan lives alone in her Buckhead townhouse, just down the road from the Georgia governor's mansion. Lita is the firstborn daughter of a prominent politically active Atlanta family. At 34 years of age, she is a spirited organizer of local charity events and fundraisers.
Well, Lita was a reflection of her parents. Emory and Joanne McClinton are phenomenal people, perhaps the most principled people that I've ever had the pleasure of representing. Lita was a very attractive, very positive, upbeat person, always had a smile on her face, always left a room with friends behind.
On a rainy Friday morning in January, Lita wakes up early and puts on her robe. At 8:20 a.m., her house guests, longtime friend Poppy Marable and Poppy's 3-year-old daughter are still asleep. Lita hears a knock at the front door. Looking out the window, she sees a flower delivery man standing on her porch. She goes to the front door and opens it.
What Lita had seen was this man appearing to be in his late 40s, early 50s maybe, with a flower box. He pulls out a gun, fires 2 to 3 shots.
Gunshots ring out across the quiet neighborhood. The first bullet misses Lita. She stumbles back away from the door, holding up the flowers in front of her face as a shield. The next bullet passes through the box and strikes her right temple. Lita and the dozen long-stemmed roses she is holding fall to the floor. Poppy Marable wakes up to the sound of gunfire. Unsure of the intruder's intentions, she grabs her 3-year-old daughter out of bed and hides with her in a closet.
There was a woman later identified as Margaret McIntyre was driving down Sladen Drive. He exited so fast he ran into a path of a vehicle, and she saw the shooter as he left.
The perpetrator now disappears into the neighborhood on foot.
And Bob Christensen, the next door neighbor to Mrs. Sullivan, got a good look at the subject, and he was also the first to render aid to the victim, Mrs. Sullivan.
Bob Christensen discovers his neighbor lying in a pool of blood. She is barely alive.
Bob Christensen runs to the phone in her house, dials 911.
Lita Sullivan is still alive by the time first responders get to her. She is immediately rushed to the hospital. Poppy Marable, shaken and stunned, calls Lita's parents, Emory and Joanne McClinton. She tells them that their daughter has been shot.
She was later pronounced dead that morning at Piedmont Hospital. I do believe her mother was with her at the time.
We're not supposed to have our children die before us. And then when you look at the particular facts of this case and why this murder was committed, then you take the normal loss that somebody has when they lose a child and magnify it and multiply it 1,000 times.
The murder of Lita Sullivan that morning sets into motion an investigation that will span nearly 2 decades. The circumstances of her death will plague the McClintons and others close to Lita for the rest of their lives. Major Welcome Harris of the Atlanta PD is the first investigator to arrive on the scene that morning.
Well, the townhouse complex is in an exclusive area of Atlanta, and quiet area also, and everyone in that complex was aroused by the gunshot.
Eyewitnesses tell Major Harris they heard 2 gunshots. Bob Christensen and Margaret McIntyre offer the best descriptions of the suspect. He is a tall man in his mid-40s, wearing a green jacket and gray pants. Harris and his partner go to work on the crime scene.
The first thing I noticed when I entered the condo was the flowers laying at a distance from the doorway in a pool of blood. Also, there were several shell casings in front of the open door. There was a shell casing, and immediately behind the door, there was another one. So it was obvious to us, became obvious that Mrs. Sullivan had retreated from her attacker.
No evidence of robbery is found. All of Lita's belongings, including her collection of expensive 19th century French antiques, are all accounted for. Police focus their efforts on the most tangible piece of evidence they have, the blood-soaked box of long-stemmed roses.
The flowers had no marking, but it obviously came from a florist. So what we did, we started canvassing and put a lookout to canvass all the florist shops in the immediate area of Sladen Drive.
Police arrive at a flower shop just half a mile up the road from the crime scene. They question the clerk, who tells them that two seedy-looking men arrived at the store between 7:30 and 8 a.m. that morning. One remained in the car out front, while the other entered the store and purchased a box of long-stemmed roses, the same kind that were found at the crime scene.
He gave us a description of the driver of the vehicle, white Toyota, and the purchaser of the flowers. Both were white males, both were bearded, and the Toyota, he remembered that it seemed to be road weary in that it had a lot of, it appeared it had been traveling through ice and snow.
The clerk at the flower shop works with a police composite artist to produce two sketches of the men he saw. Along with Bob Christensen's description, police soon release the composite drawings to the public. Authorities begin searching for the three men. Meanwhile, Poppy Marable tells investigators about an incident that occurred 3 days before the murder.
My understanding was Mrs. Sullivan had advised a friend that on Tuesday night prior to the shooting that someone tried to gain entry to hear a loud knock on the door. However, she did not open the door. And it's my opinion, based on my investigation, that it appears that that could have been possibly the first attempt to do her harm.
Poppy Marable also tells police about Lita's ongoing divorce proceedings with her wealthy husband, Jim. In fact, Lita was scheduled to appear in court for a divorce trial hearing the very day of her murder. Jim Sullivan cooperates fully with police.
Upon interviewing Mr. Sullivan for the first time, he said he didn't have any idea of anyone who might want to harm his wife.
But Sullivan behaves oddly following his estranged wife's death. Although their separation had been difficult, Jim does not contact Lita's family or attend her funeral.
Mr. Sullivan appeared to have a strained relationship with his in-laws. And we theorize that partially could be because of the divorce proceedings that were ongoing. But even at that, that still didn't make him a murderer.
The next few months of investigating yield few new leads.
You go with what you got when you initially start investigating any crime. And we were particularly concerned about the telephone records of Mr. Sullivan. So what we did, we requested his telephone records through the Florida authorities. And upon getting those records, we were able to examine them, and we found certain things that kind of jumped out at us.
What police discover in Jim Sullivan's phone records will soon steer the case in a startling new direction. On the morning of January 16th, 1987, Atlanta socialite Lita McClinton Sullivan opened her front door to a man carrying a box of long-stemmed roses. No sooner had she accepted the flowers than the man produced a 9mm handgun and shot her once in the head, leaving her to die.
She was a great person. Lita was full of life. She was bubbly and had her whole life ahead of her.
Lita LaVon McClinton was born into wealth and privilege in 1952. She had dreams of a career in fashion, and soon after college was managing an upscale clothing boutique in Atlanta. It is here in 1975 that she met a charming young businessman by the name of James Vincent Sullivan.
Everyone who ever met Lita was impressed with her, and Jim Sullivan apparently was too, because after a chance meeting of her at the department store where she worked, he returned and asked her out for a date.
He immediately charmed her with his money and trips and all that he could provide for. And she was looking for the perfect love.
Jim Sullivan was a witty and intelligent Boston Irishman who owned a successful liquor distribution company. He came from modest roots, but had always dreamt of living a life of wealth and privilege. Lita fell for Jim quickly.
Well, Jim Sullivan was described as being 150 pounds of unbridled ambition and greed.
On December 29th, 1976, Jim and Lita were married in Georgia. They moved into a spacious Collin mansion in Macon. In 1983, Jim sold his business for approximately $5 million and purchased a $2 million, 17,000 square foot mansion in the elite neighborhood of Palm Beach, Florida. But soon after leaving Georgia, Jim and Lita's marriage began to deteriorate.
Well, a short period of time after Lita and Jim were married, he began to run around and have affairs.
She was getting reports from friends that Jim was cheating on her. Lita did discover a blonde hair in her bed, in the marital bed, in fact.
Despite being quite wealthy, Jim Sullivan could be very stingy and cheap and used his money to control people. Lita eventually got to her saturation point and just got fed up and sick and tired of Jim and his antics.
After that, she packed her belongings into a U-Haul and drove to Atlanta, to the townhouse. Her townhouse was in Buckhead, which is, for years, has been a very expensive and kind of elite neighborhood in the city of Atlanta.
Well, things were not going well for Jim Sullivan in the divorce. In fact, the day that Lita was murdered, there was to be a dispositive motion on the postnuptial agreement. And by all accounts, Sullivan was not expected to win. Well, at one point, Jim Sullivan told mutual friends of he and Lita that he was going to pursue scorched earth tactics and do everything he could to make sure she didn't get a nickel.
Atlanta investigators now look to Sullivan's phone records on the day of the murder.
Upon examining the telephone records, we're able to see that on the 16th of January, he had received a phone call from Atlanta. There was 1 minute in duration within 45 minutes of the initial alarm of her being shot. So that sent up a red flag for as we were concerned. And we need to find out where that phone was located in Georgia. And upon making that phone call, a male answered the phone. And Dennis gave him some type of bogus name. And he said, well, you got the wrong numbers. This is a rest stop. He said, rest stop where? It said up 85, north of Atlanta. And we took the most likely route to the telephone, to the rest stop. And it took us approximately 45 minutes to get there. It was north of Atlanta.
The timing of the call to Jim Sullivan from the payphone after the murder is highly suspect, so police confront him as to the nature of the call.
By my understanding, he did not remember the call, and he did not, when confronted with the wife's death, he did not have anything to do with his wife's death.
Most of the people close to Lita, including her parents, suspected, many of them knew in their gut that Sullivan had done the killing, but the police couldn't prove it. They didn't have enough.
I'm innocent of all of these charges.
Sullivan continues to live the high life in Palm Beach. In August of 1987, just 8 months after Lita's death, he remarries. His new wife is a Palm Beach divorcee named Suki Rogers. As the months go by, Atlanta police become more and more determined to solve Lita's murder. They asked both the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the FBI for help. Special Agent John Kingston of the FBI is assigned to the case in 1988. He begins by re-interviewing several key witnesses.
Bob Christensen ended up being the most important of those. He lived right next door to Lita. And he told me a very interesting piece of information, which is James Sullivan called him 3 days before the murder and asked him whether he'd seen anything suspicious in and around Lita's house. As it turned out, James kept saying, hey, I think someone was knocking at her door at 4 in the morning, and so on and so forth.
Special Agent Kingston then decides to take a closer look at Sullivan's phone records.
About the same time he was calling Bob Christensen, actually just about an hour later, he called the Howard Johnson's Hotel in Sandy Springs, which is just 15 miles north of Lita's home. I knew that that was going to be an important piece of information. I knew I had to get there and find out who he called and whether they called him back. So I get the records from the manager, and they've got not only the registration records, but they've got phone records as well. So I start looking over the registration card, and I notice there's 3 people in the room. They're from North Carolina, and they're driving a Toyota, which is the type of car we were looking for. It's in the name of Johnny Furr, but that's an obvious alias. And from room 518, a call was made to Sullivan's home number. At 7:44 a.m., it lasted 2.5 minutes, again from room 518 where these folks are staying in. So I know that they called him and he called them, and they're connected somehow to this murder. What I'm putting together is that these guys came to do an attempt on Lita Sullivan's life. It didn't work out so well. They knocked on her door. She didn't come to it. So now they're trying to get him to find out if anyone saw anything or heard anything or if they've been made. And so they ask him to call around. He does. He calls Christensen, as a matter of fact. And then Christensen doesn't know anything at that point. So he calls them back and tells them, hey, you know, you didn't get spotted, so we got to go to Plan B and figure out what we're going to do from here.
Investigators compile their evidence and present it to the Fulton County District Attorney.
If Jim Sullivan was going to be prosecuted for murder, it was going to have to be the state of Georgia that brought the charges. And up until the time that other witnesses started to come forward, that wasn't going to happen. The district attorney had taken the position that he was not going to prosecute Jim Sullivan until he had the identities of all the participants in this crime.
As the decade draws to a close, no charges have been laid in the murder of Lita Sullivan. In June of 1990, Suki Rogers Sullivan, Jim's current wife, suddenly leaves him and files for a divorce. What she tells the court in her divorce hearing will provide investigators with their next big break in the case. Palm Beach millionaire James Vincent Sullivan is investigators' #1 suspect in the brutal murder of his wife, Lita McClinton Sullivan, in 1987. Although authorities have evidence of a string of phone calls made between Jim Sullivan's home in Florida and Lita's suspected murderers in Georgia, they cannot prove who exactly made the calls or discern what was said in them. In June of 1990, Suki Rogers Sullivan, who Jim had married just 8 months after Lita's death, files for divorce. She makes a stunning allegation. Suki claims that late one evening in May of 1990, Jim told her that he had arranged for the murder of his ex-wife, Lita. He explains that Lita was after his hard-earned money, that in the divorce, he would have lost his property, his savings, and his lifestyle. Suki's story is heard by the federal grand jury, which had begun investigating Sullivan for the murder of Lita earlier that year. Sullivan denies Suki's claim. He states that his comments were made in the heat of an ugly separation. News of her story, however, spreads through the Palm Beach community.
At the start of the case, some of his close friends in Palm Beach society kept their distance from him.
In 1992, Sullivan is forced to sell his prized mansion and moves into an apartment complex north of Palm Beach. He is also indicted by the federal grand jury.
The exact charge Sullivan was charged with in the federal system was use of interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire. As crazy as it sounds, the statute of limitations in the federal system is just 5 years for contract murder, but luckily that's just in the federal system.
The federal government pursued a case against Jim Sullivan in federal court, partly, I believe, because the state had not decided at that time to go forward and prosecute Jim Sullivan for murder.
Well, the case was only about a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10, but we're out of time. We're at our statute of limitations. We've got to go forward.
If convicted, Sullivan could face life imprisonment and up to $1.25 million in fines. The federal case begins on November 2nd of 1992. The prosecution presents Sukey Roger Sullivan as their star witness. They also offer evidence of the long-distance phone calls made between Jim Sullivan's home in Florida and the alleged hitman squad in Georgia.
Well, Jim Sullivan went out and hired two of the best lawyers that he could possibly have found.
Defense attorney Ed Garland argues that the prosecution has nothing to go on but innuendo, suspicion, and the desire to end an unsolved crime. He then points to the fact that there exists no clear evidence as to the nature or content of the telephone calls in question. It does not take long for the defense to discredit Sukey's testimony. She is called a gold digger, and in the wake of her hostile divorce to Jim, deemed an unreliable witness. The defense moves for a full dismissal, and U.S. District Court Judge Marvin Shube agrees.
It's important to remember that the federal indictment was not for murder. It was a very technical charge, and the judge, in granting the directed verdict in favor of Sullivan, declared in his order that the government had proven that Sullivan was probably involved in the murder. I think that's something that's very hard for the average person to understand.
The case was dismissed on November 23rd, 1992. Sullivan left the courthouse without talking to reporters, but his attorney Ed Garland told the press that the defendant, upon hearing the ruling, said a prayer of thanksgiving for the fine judicial system we have.
When the federal indictment case went to trial, Joanne and Emery were there in the courtroom day in and day out. And when the judge threw out those charges, it was an extremely difficult and devastating experience for them.
Lita McClinton's parents had no intention of letting Jim Sullivan escape justice. Since 1991, along with their attorney Brad Moores, they had been planning a civil suit against Sullivan.
One of the principal differences between a civil wrongful death case and a criminal murder case is in the civil case, the burden of proof that must be established is the preponderance of the evidence or the greater weight of the evidence. In a criminal case, the prosecutor must prove their case beyond and to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt.
Their civil trial against Sullivan takes place in 1994. The prosecution once again puts Sukey Rogers on the witness stand, and this time her testimony has a strong impact on the jury. So too does the overwhelming weight of investigators' accumulated evidence against Sullivan. On February 23, 1994, the jury finds Jim Sullivan guilty of the wrongful death of Lita McClinton Sullivan.
The result of the civil wrongful death case is we got a $4 million verdict against Jim Sullivan. The very next day, Sullivan hired a new team of lawyers who pursued appeals all the way to the Supreme Court.
Sullivan's attorneys argue that the civil charges were filed too late. The McClintons' case was brought forward well after the 2-year statute of limitation imposed by the state of Florida. On September 13th of the following year, the Florida Supreme Court overturns the verdict.
Remember that this murder was committed January 16th of 1987. It was certainly very upsetting to Joanne and Emery, and it didn't seem very just that at least for a period of time the courts held that the statute of limitations had expired and this case could not be brought. Justice delayed is justice denied. And that's a long time for anyone to have to wait for justice.
The McClintons and their attorney now turn to the media for help.
The media kept an interest in this case, which in turn kept the case alive. And if the media had not been dedicated to following this case for as many years as they did, who knows what would have happened.
Well, sure enough, one of these TV shows that comes up with an incredible important clue that hands us the break that we've been needing. And I mean, no one could have seen this coming.
Nearly a decade has passed since socialite Lita Sullivan was shot to death in her upscale Buckhead, Georgia home. Lita's friends and family, along with authorities, are convinced the man behind her murder is none other than her millionaire ex-husband, James Vincent Sullivan. Sullivan has spent 10 years denying any involvement in Lita's death and has twice called upon his high-priced legal team to avoid both criminal and civil convictions.
It was unbelievable to me that Jim was going to walk away, that everything else that the prosecution had, things that pointed to him, just weren't going to put him in jail because they didn't have the trigger man.
Having explored almost every angle of the investigation and coming up empty-handed, authorities needed a solid break. In March of 1998, that break comes from a woman living in Beaumont, Texas, named Belinda Trahan.
She told the attorney she worked for as a receptionist this story. The attorney told his wife the story, and before he could finish telling the story, his wife finished the story. And he says, "How did you know that?" And she says, "I saw it on Extra, the TV show."
Out of the blue, Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Bob Ingram receives a phone call regarding the Sullivan case.
In interviewing Belinda, when I heard what she had to say, her detail raised a red flag. Very intricate and specific, with names, dates, and places, all leading up to the conclusion that she knew exactly who was involved in this crime. And she specifically stated that her boyfriend was the killer, Tony Harwood.
Ingram shares the news with fellow investigator John Lang Jr.
Belinda Trahan told us that her former boyfriend, Tony Harwood, told her that he was hired by a Florida millionaire to kill his black wife that lived in Atlanta.
Belinda Trahan is living in North Carolina and dating a long-haul trucker by the name of Philip Anthony Harwood.
Belinda described Tony to me as just a guy from North Carolina who by trade was a mover, and what she described as just a rugged, roughneck type individual.
Harwood loves to brag, and on one occasion, he tells Belinda a strange story.
Tony Harwood told Belinda that he had moved a millionaire from Macon, Georgia to West Palm Beach, and that during the move that he, the millionaire, discussed having his wife killed in Atlanta, and he would get a pretty good paycheck out of that.
Belinda humors her boyfriend, but does not truly believe he is capable of organizing a murder. Harwood then tells Belinda even more details about his plan.
Harwood tells her after his trip to Atlanta and repeated attempts to get Lita to the door, he returns and she said, "If you want to get a woman to the door, merely deliver flowers and she'll respond."
When Tony Harwood next returns home to North Carolina, he tells Belinda her idea worked.
Harwood, after returning the second time, told her that delivering the flowers worked. And Belinda blew him off and said, "Yeah, right," and to which he responded, "Oh, it was right, I did kill her."
Strangely compelled to convince Belinda of his actions, Harwood then takes her on an all-night drive to a roadside diner.
Harwood left North Carolina after the crime, and Sullivan left Florida, and they met at a Denny's between the 2 points. and Harwood and Belinda were sitting in a booth, and when Sullivan arrived, he questioned Harwood, and Harwood vouched for Belinda. And before departing, Harwood received a folded newspaper from Sullivan containing an envelope with $25,000 that he showed Belinda. And at that time, she said, "This is real. He is the killer, and I'm right in the middle of this."
A frightened Belinda now leaves Tony Harwood for good, moves to Texas, and starts over. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation now assigns John Lang to the task of apprehending Harwood.
I took a trip to Texas and interviewed Belinda Trahan in person. Tony Harwood had been in touch with Belinda Trahan and in fact corresponded with her through the mail, and she had his return address in Albemarle, North Carolina. And when I discussed her contacting Tony, I thought perhaps that she could throw a little bait out there for him in hopes of getting him to talk about the murder on the telephone in the meantime while I was recording the conversation.
Trahan is more than willing to cooperate with investigators and makes a series of recorded phone calls to her ex-boyfriend.
And Tony Harwood was a little bit apprehensive at first to discuss aspects of the case. And he merely told her, he said, "Look, you know, if the police come to you, you don't know anything." So we knew at that time, after those conversations, that we were on the right track and we had the right person. But we wanted some additional connection between Harwood and Sullivan. So that's when I found out that Tony Harwood had worked at this moving company in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I contacted the owner of the company and found some archived records in his attic. And we went up there, and in the first box that I opened, about the second or third invoice down, there was a contract between North American Van Lines with Tony Harwood as the driver and Jim Sullivan as the mover. So I knew at that time that we had the solid connection that we needed, linking Jim Sullivan and Tony Harwood.
On the 19th of April, 1998, Tony Harwood is arrested at his home in North Carolina. He is charged with felony murder.
We went to Harwood's house initially and had an arrest warrant in hand, however, told him that we needed to talk to him at the police department. And as he was coming out of the house, he made the statement, "I've been waiting for you guys for a long time." He gave us everything we needed for the case.
Harwood admits to the details of Belinda's story. He tells investigators that he met Jim Sullivan while making a delivery to his mansion in Palm Beach in 1986. It was here that Sullivan told Harwood about his problem.
Sullivan met Harwood as a result of Harwood moving him, and Sullivan approached Harwood to take care of a problem. His wife back in Georgia, who was about to take him for all he was worth. Sullivan clearly played the victim in this, and Harwood said that he would eliminate the problem for Sullivan.
Tony Harwood also corroborates and fills in many of the details of the initial murder investigation. He had enlisted the help of two others and traveled to Atlanta with them. It was his writing on the Howard Johnson's registration book. And they had driven a white Toyota. Most importantly, Tony provides the contents of the call made from the rest area that day, 40 minutes after Lita was shot.
Harwood does the shooting, called Sullivan's mansion. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning, and gives just 2 words, "Merry Christmas," which was a prearranged code message that the job had been done.
For all the information Tony Harwood provides, he never does reveal the names of his accomplices. He does, however, agree to testify against Jim Sullivan in court in exchange for a reduced sentence in the killing of Lita Sullivan. He pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter and receives a sentence of 20 years in prison.
After Harwood gave his confession to us, we knew we had enough probable cause for Jim Sullivan.
District Attorney's Office called Sullivan's attorneys and said, hey, we have the trigger man and we're proceeding with an indictment.
Sullivan's attorneys respond by saying that since Sullivan still had nothing to hide, he would promptly and willingly turn himself over to investigators.
Sullivan was supposed to turn himself in to authorities on a Monday. However, he never did appear, and the hunt was on at that time.
The hunt won't be easy. Jim Sullivan has fled the country, and with his resources of cash and charisma, he could be anywhere in the world. "11 years have passed since the murder of Joanne and Emery McClinton's firstborn daughter, Lita. Lita's millionaire husband, Jim Sullivan, is authorities' #1 suspect. But for years, the McClintons watch as their ex-son-in-law uses his money and influence to maneuver around the law. In 1998, investigators find the evidence the McClintons had been hoping for. Long-haul trucker Philip Anthony Harwood is arrested and confesses to being hired by Sullivan to murder Lita in 1987. A warrant is issued for Sullivan's arrest, and upon hearing of it, he flees the country. Fulton County Assistant District Attorney Sheila Ross is preparing the case against Sullivan when she hears of his disappearance.
So at the time that Tony Harwood identified Jim Sullivan to the GBI in 1998, we believed that he was in Costa Rica. He had a house in Costa Rica. That was his last known residence, was in Costa Rica. However, we searched for him in Costa Rica. He was not there. He had fled Costa Rica, and we had really no idea where he had gone from there.
James Sullivan, the working-class boy from the south side of Boston, had spent his entire life jealously and viciously protecting his financial achievements. Police understand that a man who could put his ambition and wealth above all else, even the value of human life, would never willingly turn himself in. The search for Jim Sullivan is turned over to the FBI.
Well, we were initially contacted by the Atlanta Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation that requested our assistance in attempting to locate James Sullivan, who they had recently obtained a murder warrant for. We had an initial meeting with both agencies, obtained all the information that we needed. We're also told that he may have fled to the country of Costa Rica. I obtained a federal fugitive warrant for Mr. Sullivan, charging him with leaving the state of Georgia after being charged in this state with a felony.
The FBI move in on Sullivan's residence in Costa Rica, but he is not at home. Costa Rican locals, neighbors, and Sullivan's associates are questioned. Police learn that Sullivan paid a local bartender to drive him out of Costa Rica and into Panama.
Further investigation with our individuals that cover Panama, they were able to determine that he had fled by commercial airline from Panama City to Caracas, Venezuela.
Once we found that Sullivan had gone to Caracas, he virtually disappeared, and we had no contact with him.
Police lose Sullivan's trail in Venezuela.
We knew Sullivan had 2 passports. He had a valid United States passport, and he also had an Irish passport. We knew he also had vast means to travel and get about different parts of the world. We had flagged his passports through Interpol, but we were not getting any hits off of his passports through Interpol. So we knew he had a lot of resources, and he could use those resources to flee, to change his identity, to do many things that would allow him to evade capture.
Sullivan now leads authorities on a 4-year manhunt around the globe.
We used many different techniques in attempting to locate Mr. Sullivan. They included putting his name and picture in the media. We used America's Most Wanted. Another technique that we attempted to use was to check and investigate his monetary background, trying to see where he had his money stored, how his money was spent. We also made contact with his attorney. His attorney was not cooperative with us and claimed attorney-client privilege and would not provide us any information.
Finally, after 4 years of searching, Mike Green gets the break he's been looking for.
In early April 2002, I received a phone call from our agent that was covering leads for us in the country of Thailand. He called me up and said, "You won't believe it, but we were able to verify through the Thai authorities that Mr. Sullivan had made official entry into Thailand."
To generate more information, Green arranges for Sullivan to be featured on a TV show, America's Most Wanted, this time including an update as to a suspected location.
We featured Mr. Sullivan on America's Most Wanted, and the night that we featured him, I received another phone call from the agent in Thailand as well as from an anonymous caller, both verifying a specific location for Mr. Sullivan.
Sullivan was living with his fourth wife that he had married, and they were living about 100 miles from Bangkok, living down there somewhere near the water.
Thai authorities begin watching Sullivan while the State Department prepares for his arrest. On the 2nd of July 2002, FBI agents and Thai police descend upon Sullivan and his wife as they return home from a walk on the beach. Sullivan, now 63 years of age, is taken to an overcrowded prison in Bangkok, where he spends the next 19 months desperately fighting his extradition back to the United States.
In March of 2004, I was asked by our agent that works in Thailand to come to Thailand to assist in extraditing Mr. Sullivan back to the United States. When I first met Mr. Sullivan, he made some mention that this was all a lie and a big mistake. He didn't appear to be very happy. I think he realized that the conditions in the Thai prisons compared to the United States prisons are very much different. During that time, I realized he had contracted gout. He was wearing a slipper or a sandal on one of his feet, and that was one of his big complaints, was his treatment while in the Thai prison.
On March 26th, a disheveled Jim Sullivan lands in Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in Atlanta. He is wearing a surgical mask and only one shoe. After 6 years of running, Sullivan is back on American soil.
There was an overwhelming motive for him wanting his wife dead. He had 4 million reasons to want her dead. We also had Belinda Trahan identifying Sullivan from a 6-person photographic lineup. We had Tony Harwood, who said that Sullivan hired him to kill his wife and that he indeed took money from Sullivan to kill his wife. We also had phone records corroborating Belinda's testimony and Harwood's testimony that connected Sullivan and Harwood in 1987. We also had moving records from Tony Harwood's moving company, which connected and put together Tony Harwood and Jim Sullivan 2 months prior to the murder. And we also had Jim Sullivan's slight evidence of guilt, meaning the moment that he gets captured, the moment he hears that Tony Harwood is in custody, he flees all the way around the world to avoid facing a Fulton County jury on these charges.
On March 14, 2006, James Vincent Sullivan is sentenced to life in prison without parole. His great ambition and his long rise to the top will end here.
I have no doubt that Jim Sullivan thought he was going to get away with this crime. But those days are over, obviously, because he will spend the rest of his life waking up every morning on a steel cot in an isolated cell in a maximum security penitentiary in Georgia.
Credit definitely goes with the feds and the Atlanta police and the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. The key word is perseverance. They never let it go. They kept pursuing it wherever it needed to be pursued.
Emery and Joanne waited almost 20 years for justice in this case. And they will never get over the loss of their daughter, especially under circumstances like this. There's nothing that is going to ever bring Lida back. It's hard to understand how anyone can get through a loss like this without thinking about this loss every single day. And I'm sure Emery and Joanne think about Lida every single day of their life.